Having talked about section 2, wherein we understood the overemphasis on the content of the work of art, in this section, uh, she talks about the nature of interpretation in section 3 of her essay. The interpretation, as I mentioned earlier, is an act of reading and coming to the meaning. So, interpretation is a radical strategy. She calls interpretation as a radical strategy for conserving an old text. Conservation, you might be knowing, for retaining an old text, which is thought too precious to repudiate by revamping it. Generally, there are people who are conservist. Conservation is a kind of act of retaining the old things. And the critics who believe in interpretation, who think that interpretation is very important, according to Sontag, these critics, for these critics, interpretation is a radical strategy for conserving old texts. Because now they think that old texts are very precious, very important, and they can't be revamped at all. They can't be changed. We should not, muddle with that. So, what is the interpreter doing here? The interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering it. This is her opinion. She is talking against interpretation. Rather, the person who interprets believes that it is a strategy of conserving an old text, but that is not happening. What is happening actually? The interpreter himself or herself is actually erasing or rewriting the text by interpreting it. Interpretation is the process of altering the meaning, but such person can't admit to doing so. But they don't admit it because interpretation is an act of imposing your meaning on the text. But the people who interpret the text, they claim to be only making it intelligible. Means they are simply disclosing its true meaning. But according to Sontag, this is not the case. An interpreter is not simply disclosing the true meaning of the text, rather, he is altering the meaning itself. Although the interpreter does not admit this, does not accept this particular fact. So the interpreter rather alter the text. Alter means, I told you, interpreters alter means change the meaning of the text. However far they do so, they must claim to be reading off a sense that is already there. Means they they think that they are disclosing the true meaning of the text. That is their personal understanding. But what they are doing, rather, they are taking the readers away from the text, from the meaning itself. They are not trying to give the original meaning, to disclose the true meaning. They're not trying to make it intelligible. Rather, they're taking the readers away from the text. And then she explains it with the help of the example in the rabbinic and Christian spiritual interpretations of the clearly erotic Song of Songs. So this is the reference to religion. So the spiritual interpretation. Now you might be knowing in other religions as well. It is the priest who interprets the text. The priest tries to tell the meaning, but rather this is not the case. Sontag thinks. The priest is rather taking the readers away from the true meaning, the original meaning of the text. Then now she comes to an example from interpretation in modern times with reference to Karl Marx and Freud's hermeneutics. The hermeneutics is the branch of interpretation. It deals with interpretation of the text. So interpretation in our own time, means in modern times, is even more complex according to Sontag. Because the contemporary zeal for the project of interpretation is often prompted not only by pity toward the troublesome text, which may conceal an aggression, but by an open aggressiveness and overt contempt for appearances. That's what she thinks. Okay, Mercy thinks that in the modern times, especially in Marx and Freud's hermeneutics, the process of interpretation is more complex, wherein the zeal means here the enthusiasm. The interpreter tries to come up with the interpretation, task of interpretation, and this task of interpretation is often prompted not by pt means out of helping others here, that here pt stands for trivial thing. Okay, means in order to conceal means hide an aggression, but by an open aggressiveness means the form is ignored, the contempt for appearances is overt. Overt means something which can be easily noticed, something which can easily be seen. So this aggressiveness is open. At the same time, the contempt means hatred for appearances is also clearly visible. So the old style of interpretation was insistent but respectful. So she compares the old style of interpretation. Of course, it emphasized on interpretation, but that was a bit respectful because it erected another meaning on top of the literal one. Means it came up with the literal and figurative meaning. Whereas the modern style of interpretation excavates means what? It try to find the meaning, and in this attempt it destroys. It digs behind the text to find subtext, okay, which is the true one. Is, for example, Marxist criticism tries to find the social and economic meaning of Freud's hermeneutics, try to find the psychological side. Okay, so this is something, digging out to dig behind the text to find a subtext. Okay, so the most celebrated and influential modern doctrines of Marx and Freud actually amount to elaborate systems of hermeneutics. Means they try to interpret the things. So in our view, these are aggressive and impious theories of interpretation. Okay, they go into the depth, they excavate. What is Marathi term? Utkhanan. So that's what they do exactly. So we know Freud's view. In Freud's view, all observable phenomena are bracketed as manifest content. Means observable behavior has its roots in unconsciousness. Okay. That is only manifest content. Beyond that, there is something which is hidden, and the manifest content must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning. That is the latent content. Latent means hidden, something which is hidden. It is beneath. Beneath means something inside, and the meaning has to be found. Okay, for Marx, for example, again, social events like revolutions and wars, while for Freud, the events of individual lives. So we are already familiar with both the theories, like neurotic symptoms and slips of tongue. When we talk, then time, we come across slips of tongue, certain disorder, mental disorder, as well as texts like a dream or work of art. So all are treated as occasions for interpretation. So in case of Marx, social events as revolutions and wars. In case of Freud, these individual lives and texts, they are subject for interpretations. So for according to both Marx and Freud, these events only seem to be intelligible, but they have no meaning without interpretation. One has to excavate, one has to go for the latent meaning. For in their view, to understand is to interpret, and to interpret is to restate the phenomenon. Remarkable thing has to be restated so that we find an equivalent meaning. So Sontag thinks that interpretation is not an absolute value, a gesture of mind situated in some timeless realm of capabilities. It must be evaluated. It is not as plain as we think. It must be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. So, in certain cultural contexts, in certain cultures, interpretation is a liberating act. Liberating means freeing the meaning. The meaning is hidden. It is enslaved in the words, in the form. The content is, the message is not seen. One has to excavate, liberate it. So it is a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. And in other cultural context, it is reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling. So such kind of interpretation, Jati. Means in certain contexts, interpretation is a liberating act, whereas in certain other contexts, it is a reactionary, a reactionary act. Means it is a kind of revisiting the past, rather finding the past. And in the other context, it can be escapism, escaping from the fact. So this is how interpretation is being criticized by Susan Sontag. The title itself is implicit enough. She is writing against interpretation. She believes in art for art's sake. So for such critics, for the form is important. The content is not so much important. Now we shall go ahead with section 4.